Good morning, DawgNation. I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Kroger. We are happy to have you with us. Fun show for us here today. Before we're done, kind of interesting insight into a Georgia player that could be kind of a name and a star on the rise. Great player on the field, terrific personality, and a major impact position group. We'll get to that. Also, ESPN yesterday, we sort of focused on the sort of negative-ish thing that they said about Georgia. How about a really positive evaluation of one Georgia position group? We'll give you some of that. Jeff Sentell stops by. UGA recruiting talk coming up with him. And also this, to kick things off here today, a pretty interesting observation as it relates to maybe the thing that matters more than anything else this day and age in college football. How's your NIL spending? Well, at least somebody thinks Georgia's about to crank it up in a big way when it comes to that. We'll give you that to start things here today. We're glad to have you with us for it. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Kroger. And it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Kroger, fresh for everyone.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
So I don't think there's any doubt that probably the hottest topic around college football last couple of years, college athletics in general, I guess, has been name, image, likeness revenue, and we call that NIL. We're led to believe that Ohio State put a gigantic NIL spend together to build a roster to win the national championship this past season, and we're also kind of led to believe as you move ahead into the future, you know, how well your NIL spending goes for you is going to determine how much success that you're going to have on the field. And by the way, even in the kind of new landscape we're about to be in, where you perhaps heard of the House settlement, this is a court case that opens the door for what we're going to call like revenue sharing, where players will be paid directly by their athletic departments coming from the main bucket of revenue they get, the TV contracts. Even with that, there is still going to be what we think of as NIL. Whether it'll remain secret or it'll be open to public scrutiny, I think is still up for some discussion. But NIL is sort of the big topic that's out there. And unfortunately, even though that it's the hottest topic of them all, we don't always have a lot in the way of true specifics about what's going on, the same way we do with coaches' salaries or in professional sports player salaries. There are well-established databases around all of that. The information essentially must be public. But when it comes to NIL, everything has been allowed to remain private. And so therefore, we're kind of forced to speculate. And oftentimes our suspicions turn out to be true. Sometimes I think they're probably not. But that's just sort of what it is that we're only able to make guesses, educated guesses perhaps, but only guesses as to what is going on. And some of the guesses that people have been making is that while Georgia is clearly spending a lot of money, it wouldn't be competitive if it wasn't. The speculation has been that perhaps Georgia is not as aggressive as some other programs are when it comes to name, image, and likeness. We don't know the specifics of how true that is, but we do believe, many of us anyway, probably many of you, that that's directionally accurate, that there is a level of spending, a threshold that some programs are either so desperate that they have to go to or so willing to go to, that Georgia at this point in time has been, I think the word we use sometimes, we've heard it used by others, is judicious. Georgia's just a little bit more cautious and judicious. Georgia's just a little bit more careful about some of the spending. That's been the speculation. However, if that is true, there is perhaps reason today to believe that that might be changing, that perhaps there is a new landscape on the horizon where Georgia's behavior when it comes to NIL, especially as it relates to recruiting, some smart people think maybe things are about to be a little different for UGA than they have been before. I want to give you an example of that. There's a guy named Steve Wiltfong. Perhaps you've heard of him. One of the bigger names in kind of the recruiting information industry, a guy who talks a lot of recruits, publishes a lot of stuff, very active on social media. One of the more prolific producers of recruiting news out there is Steve Wiltfong. Wiltfong let me try to speak English. Wiltfong recently made an appearance on one of the podcasts for the outlet that he works for, On3. And on this On3 podcast, I guess I only saw this in a clip that was shared on the internet. I guess the subject of Georgia and NIL spending came up, and Wiltfong, who is very plugged in, one of the more respected names in that part of the industry, Wiltfong says that he detects what's about to be a little bit of a change of behavior when it comes to Kirby Smart and NIL. Wiltfong gets very specific in describing why he believes this is going to be. It is interesting enough that from our friends at On3, it's worth playing on this show, at least for a few seconds. This is Steve Wiltfong saying Georgia about to really cut loose when it comes to some NIL spending. Here he is from On3.
I think this is truly the recruiting cycle where we see Kirby Smart and Georgia kind of let it rip a little bit more on the NIL front. I think when you talk to some people, I think that to a certain degree, I think he thought that people were full of at how much they were actually getting. Georgia was winning with the way that they were recruiting and developing players internally. But to have some misses on the recruiting trail and know that those misses were purely because of NIL, I think we're seeing Georgia arming up in that arena more than ever in 2026 as well.
So once again, Steve Wiltfong, a very respected person, so what he says is going to carry a lot of weight. And when he says in a very matter-of-fact fashion that Georgia has lost in the last couple of years a couple of recruiting battles solely because of NIL, well, I think a lot of us sort of suspect some of that to be true, even though it's never confirmed. You honestly don't really need much confirmation. Sometimes sort of know what you see with your own eyes. It's still interesting to hear someone who does have sources, is plugged in, does have, connections, basically give voice to what a lot of people feel like they have seen is that, hey, Georgia was at the 5-yard line on this guy, ultimately didn't quite get him. Certainly seems like NIL was the case. Wiltfong very clearly and specifically says, yes, that is indeed true. So from one vantage point, if a guy like Steve Wiltfong says, whatever his phrasing was, ready to let it rip, if a guy like Wiltfong, who has a big following, who has a history of getting a lot of stuff right, if he says, hey, Georgia's ready to let it rip when it comes to NIL, there are a lot of Georgia fans, perhaps rightly so, that'll take that as good news, and they'll say, good, I'm ready to see him rip it. I'm ready to see big spending take place here. I'm ready to see Georgia kind of money whip some other people for some players the same way it sort of seems like in the past. Georgia has kind of fallen victim to that sort of thing, and perhaps that is what we'll see take place here. In fact, coming up in a couple of minutes, we'll give you an example of specifically how we might see some evidence of this in the very near future. I think that's interesting from Steve Wiltfong. But let me also, because I think this is an interesting topic, try to provide you a little bit of nuance on this, though, in three specific areas. Wiltfong says Georgia's about to let it rip when it comes to NIL spending. A lot of Georgia fans say, good, I'm ready to see it. And maybe we will indeed see that here in this class of 2026. But just to make sure we're fair and balanced, and just to make sure we provide all of the additional context necessary for a conversation like this, let's look at three things for a minute. Wiltfong says that he thinks that Kirby Smart thought others were full of you-know-what when some of these numbers were thrown around, and he kind of chuckles about that. But the truth is, when it comes to NIL spending and what's going on, there are a lot of people who are full of you-know-what. There are a lot of exaggerated claims in the NIL space. That's been true since NIL spending first started. It remains true now. That doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of players who are getting a lot of money, and some of that is just like eye-popping, oh my gosh, I can't believe the money. That doesn't mean that in one respect is not true, but for every true story you hear as it relates to NIL spending, I'm guessing there are multiples of stories that are either exaggerated or just not true or somehow missing important context. So if Smart thinks there are a bunch of people in the NIL space who are full of you-know-what, we would say there's pretty good reason to feel that way. So in defense of Kirby Smart, probably important to point that out. And when it comes to the overall suggestion, I don't think that Wiltfong had any kind of nefarious motives here or anything like that. But when it comes to the overall suggestion that perhaps Georgia has not been, quote unquote, letting it rip prior to this when it comes to NIL, there are certainly some recruits we would say that Georgia has clearly lost because of more aggressive NIL spending by whoever it was they were competing with in that given moment. It's also important to note this, that in college football right now, at Georgia and other places, one of the biggest areas that we are seeing NIL spending kind of being used is through roster retention. And for college football overall, that's sort of been the story of the last year of, there were rumors that so-and-so might go in the transfer portal, but he didn't. Other players that you thought might be ripe for the poaching, we never even really heard rumors about those guys. That certainly it seems like from 2024 going into 2025, that one of the biggest ways that teams are using their budget, whatever their budget happens to be, is make sure their own players they already know are a good fit for their program, players they already see succeeding on the field, and in some cases players their fans have kind of fallen in love with and enjoy cheering for. We're seeing NIL dollars being used to retain rosters. And at Georgia specifically, I think there's a pretty big success story around a lot of this because Georgia has been kind of the deepest, most talented roster in college football, and therefore perhaps the easiest to poach guys off of just because there are so many potential guys to poach. And if we want to go back in time to not all that long ago, just 2 years ago, almost exactly at this time of year, do you remember G-Day 2023 when on G-Day we found out that Bear Alexander, who had been kind of a interesting young prospect for Georgia in 2022, had sort of shown out in that year's national title game, was thought to be, and this is, there's a lot of water under the bridge with Bear since this moment, but, back in spring of 2023, Bear Alexander in some respects was thought to be sort of a rising star on the Georgia roster defensively. And then on G-Day, kind of the worst, most embarrassing timing of them all, we find out that Bear's not here. He's going to USC. And I think if we're being honest, whether it be a media person like me or perhaps a fan like you, I think if we're being honest, at that moment in our lives as college football fans, I think some of us are pretty concerned. Concerned for the sport overall, and maybe that hasn't totally dissipated, but concerned for Georgia in particular in that, well, gosh, if a guy that's such a big part of your future plans can just disintegrate right here on G-Day, then what are we about to see? What world are we about to live in if guys like this are going to be transferring all the time? And the truth is there are rumors all the time of so-and-so might transfer. But honestly, Georgia's doing a pretty good job of keeping the guys that it really wants, that it really has big plans for, that really have bright futures at UGA. Now you're losing some guys from your depth, and Kirby will tell you, up one side and down the other, they don't have as much depth as they used to, and that's probably true. But when it comes to sort of calamitous transfer departures where somebody else just swooped in and took somebody right out from underneath you, well, I know the Georgia coaches lose a lot of sleep, worry about that kind of stuff. For the most part, they've been fairly successful in preventing that from happening. So therefore, if you're wondering, hey, when is Georgia going to let it rip when it comes to NIL spending? I would suggest that they probably are, to a degree, letting it rip more so than you realize. Because, and I've said this before, you never read the story about who doesn't transfer. You read the story about who does transfer. Sometimes you hear the rumor about who might transfer. But when all of that just dissolves back into the ether, there's really no story ever written about what didn't happen. But there are a lot of things at Georgia the last couple of years that didn't happen that mattered just as much, if not more so, than things that did. So as we're talking about what Georgia may be about to be when it comes to NIL, I think that's an important thing to consider. And let me give you one more important thing to consider on all of this. Clearly, NIL spending matters in college football. We said to kick off the show a couple of minutes ago that Ohio State you can almost trace back, not the sole reason, but Ohio State's aggressive NIL spending, bringing in some well-placed transfers, keeping guys who had been on their roster happy and in Columbus. Very big part of the success formula for Ohio State this past year. No denying that whatsoever. But the line between how much you spend and how much you win is never going to be quite as straight as some people want it to be. And the reason why kind of goes beyond just the boundaries of college football. There is no easy button in life. There is no obvious, easy thing you can do that guarantees success. And certainly if spending money was that, that's the sort of thing, if anybody could do it, anybody would do it, because you could always raise money if you were guaranteed that money would produce results. But it's not a guarantee. And as college football becomes more and more like the NFL, let me give you one thing to think about on that. I did, believe it or not, a little bit of research on this in preparation for the topic. The best that I can tell, and I went back as far as 2018. That's all the time I had to do. I don't know how true this would be going back how far into the past, but from the present all the way back to 2018, the best that I can tell, I'll invite you to double check me on this, for each year, 2018, 2019, all the way through 2024, the team that spent the most in free agency for that given year, going all the way back to 2018, I only saw one instance of a team that also won a playoff game that same year. And that was Buffalo, like 2022 or something like that. Going all the way back to 2018, I only saw one instance of the biggest spending team in free agency also winning a playoff game in the same year in which it was the top free agent spender. Oftentimes, you see the teams that spend the most in free agency improve their season win total, but a lot of times that's because it's a Carolina from this past year or a Denver a couple of years ago, teams that had really bad records, and so therefore they were sort of destined for improvement perhaps no matter what. When it comes to the true name of the game, actual playoff success, the biggest spending team in free agency, at least since 2018, only one instance that I found of that team also winning a playoff game in that same year. And college football won't exactly be that same way, but it will be similar, is that oftentimes big spending does reek of a certain level of desperation. So kind of keep all of this in mind here is that while, yes, you want to be able to let it rip in NIL, and you better be able to spend if you want the best players and the best chance of winning. But in the NFL, we don't just simply judge your efforts on did you get the player or not. There's always the caveat of the player at what price, because sometimes what you say no to in terms of a bidding war and a price, auction, sometimes what you say no to is just as important as what you're willing to say yes to. And if you mortgage your future for one player, then your future may be a little bit in jeopardy. But to kind of come back to the positive in all of this, for Georgia fans who like it when a big national recruiting analyst says Georgia's about to spend big in NIL, the truth is we may not have to wait very long to find out how right Wiltfong is about this. We know we're coming up on Cinco de Mayo very soon. That'll be commitment decision date for five-star quarterback Jared Curtis. Sam Spiegelman, different recruiting analyst working for Rivals, got a chance to talk to the camp close to Curtis. This means his agent, things like that. And what Spiegelman reported on X this week is that the race between Georgia and Oregon is, quote, extremely close, and that both schools have, quote, everything a quarterback can dream of. Now, when it comes from player agents like this, a lot of this is just designed to sort of raise the bidding war and keep the price increasing for a player like Curtis. But the point of all this is maybe for Georgia that's not such a bad thing. If what Wiltfong says that Georgia's really ready to let it rip, one of the best ways to show that you're ready to let it rip is with a five-star quarterback like Jared Curtis. So for those who've assumed if it comes down to money, then Jared's obviously going to Eugene to play for the Ducks, maybe not quite so fast on that. We may not have to wait very long to find out just how aggressive Georgia's willing to be when it comes to NIL. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Kroger. We are glad you were with us. No matter how you get to us, video, 10 a.m., radio, Athens Sports Radio, 960 The Ref, podcast, wherever you find them. So many different ways to connect with our show. And so thankful that you've chosen one that works for you. We try to make the show widely available, and we just hope you can find something that you love. We are glad you are here on all of that. And by the way, thanks to our friends at Kroger who make it all possible. And thanks to them for making the fun continue when it comes to Kroger Chef Jr. We've talked about Kroger Chef Jr. a lot throughout the years. I think it's great. You want to have a wonderful experience with your family, a guided kids cooking experience that's really affordable, just $7 per child, and some really fun stuff being made, including coming up this weekend, Indian chicken. Actually, that was last weekend. So listen, there'll be great opportunities to have more Kroger Chef Jr. Moments, $7 per child, guided kids cooking experience. You get an apron, a chef hat, a cooking tool, a recipe card, a badge. Always fun paraphernalia to kind of go along with the chance for the kids to sort of learn how cooking experiences work, how food preparation process works. It's always a fun, unique experience. So I want you to check out the website, KrogerChefJr.com. That's JUNIOR. Kroger Chef Jr., the word junior spelled out in this case, KrogerChefJr.com for a lot more on that. All right, coming up in a moment, we're going to ask Jeff Sentell directly when he joins us. Hey, is Georgia ready to be as aggressive as some are suggesting when it comes to NIL? Is it the reason they've lost out on players in the past? And how might this impact some of the recruiting battles we're seeing take shape right now? And what kind of went wrong for Georgia and the five-star that got away from this weekend? I should say from this past week. All of that with Jeff Sentell coming up in just a moment. Prior to that, let's get ready to go around the DawgHouse, presented today by our friends at Zagoria Law. And, yesterday we kind of focused in on the negative for a moment. ESPN sharing what it believed Georgia's biggest weakness was for the upcoming season. By the way, more on that in a moment. Let us also now look at the positive of this, that ESPN, for all of its way too early top 25 teams, Georgia ranked number 5 in that way too early poll for all of those teams. ESPN focusing on both the top strength and the biggest weakness. So let's spend a little time here talking about the big strength for Georgia, and perhaps unsurprisingly, just given the track record of success of the program, ESPN, and it's Mark Schlabach, who's the writer here, really zeroes in on the linebackers. What Schlabach writes is, even after losing star linebacker Jalen Walker, a potential first-round pick in the NFL draft, and 3-year starter Smile Mondon, Georgia's linebackers figure to be the heart of the defense in 2025. Schlabach says C.J. Allen is the leader of the unit after ranking second on the team with 76 tackles to go with 3 tackles for loss and 5 quarterback hurries last season. But Gabe Harris Jr. and Raylan Wilson got plenty of action last season too, and Chris Cole was named the All-SEC freshman team by the league's coaches. He says Allen, Cole, and Wilson were ranked either number 1 or number 2 linebacker prospects in the class of 2023 and 2024 by the ESPN recruiting analysts. And Georgia coach Kirby Smart also added freshman Zayden Walker, the number 1 outside linebacker prospect in the class of 2025. Now, we believe that Walker's going to play a lot of inside linebacker for Georgia. And while we like Schlabach a lot, this is an example of sometimes what we see, which is, okay, well, you're hearing Chris Cole mentioned there. We're going to do more on Chris Cole later on in the show. But a name that you don't hear Schlabach mention, but we think is going to be just as important as anything when it comes to what's happening behind Raylan Wilson and C.J. Allen this year, and perhaps pushing for playing time to the point they're not quite so behind anybody else on this Georgia roster, that Justin Williams is just as valuable as Chris Cole and perhaps one of the most important players in this team. And somehow it seems like, and the way in which Georgia replenishes its depth at inside linebacker in particular, now outside linebacker and the edge rushing spot, there's a lot of unknowns related to that. Inside linebacker, it just seems like Georgia replicates this year after year. We've got a couple of starters who could be national award contenders and a couple of backups who make people sometimes wonder, well, my gosh, are these backups going to end up being even better? That there's a lot of that sort of happens. And while maybe national media not quite as aware of who Justin Williams is, you certainly know those closest to Georgia are aware of that, and that he, along with Chris Cole, a big reason why the Georgia linebackers this year have a chance to be such a strength. This is what Kirby Smart said about both of his young but emerging linebackers going back to Tuesday.
Both going to be good football players. Those both very conscientious, hard workers. I've started a new ritual of asking a guy at the end of practice who he thinks the hardest worker is. Who works the hardest, who practices the hardest when you watch the tape? Who do you say has that passion and fire that's sometimes lacking all over college football now? It's a different climate in college football. So it's funny because Chris Cole and Justin Williams have both been mentioned multiple times by people as extremely hard work guys. They work hard, and I appreciate that, Margaret.
Yeah, so I think that's interesting, and I think it does sort of show the oversight of not mentioning Williams in that particular piece. And let me just say this, we talk about this a lot, that sometimes it's valuable to get the perspective outside of DawgNation, outside of our bubble, because, listen, if you've ever used a microscope before, you know this. Sometimes when you zoom in too closely, you distort what it is that you're looking at. And we say this all the time, that Georgia fans obviously might be tempted to kind of exaggerate Georgia's strengths, but also because of the way we fixate on this, we have a tendency to exaggerate Georgia's blemishes too. And we forget that if we watched other teams and investigated other teams as closely as we investigate Georgia, we would see blemishes for any other team in America there as well. So sometimes being really, really close to something distort your overall image and your vision about that particular thing. And so therefore the national perspective can be valuable. There were other times, though, we're reminded that people who are trying to follow 16 different teams in the SEC or 130-something teams when it comes to FBS football, they are clearly not going to know everything that could be known about a given team, and perhaps not realizing that Williams is just as valuable as Cole, and a guy that's just as respected by his Georgia teammates, as Kirby Smart suggests there, is a pretty important piece of information to possess. By the way, before we're done today, more on Justin Williams in particular about exactly what it is that he brings to the table for Georgia, and Williams' own assessment of why he thinks his linebacker core this year could be so good. That's going to be really fun before our show is done here today. But let me also give you this for a moment, and I'm mad at myself because I forgot to make this graphic. You may have seen this. So our Instagram account, I don't have any control over our Instagram account, but our Instagram account had taken the Schleybaugh quote that we used in the show yesterday of the Georgia running backs being a weakness for Georgia, kind of an unknown commodity, a little bit of a weakness. And, Schleybaugh saying that, kind of an interesting quote. So we put that up on our Instagram just to sort of make people aware of what's being said about Georgia football here right now. Well, Nate Frazier saw, and he kind of reposted it and said that essentially saying that he was going to use that as a high level of motivation, that he did not appreciate the disrespect coming from ESPN on that. A lot of Georgia fans were very happy to see Nate Frazier so fired up about that. So it's a fun time of year. Kirby Smart, in various things that he said, including in that comment about the linebackers a moment ago, that finding the passion, finding the fire, finding the energy is not easy for any college football team right now. Those are not flippant remarks from Smart when he says it as repeatedly as he has. And therefore, finding the players on your team that give you a chance to instill that, really important. Frazier, an example of that offensively, guys like Cole and Williams, on the basis of their teammates, are guys who also provide that for Georgia. So as we're looking for that renewed motivation, and as Smart has said, a new hunger, new energy to achieve great success here this year, it seems like some of these young Georgia players are doing a good job of kind of finding that here right now, and that is a lot of fun, and that is also around the DawgHouse, presented today by our friends at Zagoria Law. Obviously, Nate Frazier is a dog that's got some bite, which is a good thing, but other dogs that perhaps bite you, not a good thing at all. And in those cases, that's a very serious thing, and that's what our friends at Zagoria Law sort of live to serve. If you or someone have been bitten by a dog, sometimes you just get these big dogs get loose, they're running around, they knock you over, injure you. In a situation like that, you probably feel like any other personal injury claim, you want proper compensation for that. That's what our friends at Zagoria Law can provide for you. They literally wrote the book on how to win these types of cases. They're the official dog bite injury lawyers of the Georgia Bulldogs. And you can give them a call, 833-GA-DOG-BITE. That's their phone number. Conventional spelling for dog, D-O-G, 833-GA-DOG-BITE. You can also find them online, ZagoriaLaw.com, Z-A-G-O-R-I-A, ZagoriaLaw.com. If you or someone you love been injured by a dog, bitten by a dog, owner wasn't taking proper care of that dog, there was negligence involved, well, you may be owed some compensation for pain and suffering, for medical bills, things like that. And our friends from Zagoria Law want to help you get what you feel like you deserve. So one more time, 833-GA-DOG-BITE or ZagoriaLaw.com. Great to have Zagoria Law as a part of Around the DawgHouse here today. So before we're done, we're not finished talking about Georgia linebackers. A couple of really fun things as it relates to that. We'll give you an update on our Golden Shoe Bracket Challenge after kind of a wild night in the Sweet 16 last night of some pretty impressive showings from the SEC teams. Another SEC team collapses, so we'll cover all of that. But for now, let's get everything about the world of Georgia recruiting from Jeff Sentell, who's out there on the recruiting trail even as we speak here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Let's say hello to Jeff Sentell. We talk UGA recruiting here, and in this day and age, that means more and more discussion about the role that NIL plays in all of this. Jeff, we played some audio before you joined us. Steve Wiltfong, national analyst for On3, predicting that, to use his phrase, Georgia's ready to let it rip when it comes to NIL spending and about to apparently spend far more in recruiting for for this 2026 class than perhaps they have in the past. Do you believe that's true?
Brendan, good morning, sir. I think they started letting it rip probably last recruiting cycle with the five stars they ended up with. I think that would be a new program high that I don't think Georgia will reach in the future. But as much as Georgia can let it rip, my man, they're going to let it rip. Remember those games we would play on Instagram where you have $20 and you have to pick this player and this player and this player? I think that's what Georgia is going to be doing in this cycle, except they're going to do it with maybe a pool of like $5 million for their freshmen, because you got to remember the total revenue settlement pool is about $14 million for the Dawgs. So I think that's the culture now of they're going to try and spend what they can. But in all honesty, my man, I think they started spending a lot last cycle for sure.
So a couple of things on that. Thing number one is you mentioned the revenue payments, capped at around 13 or 14 million for Georgia, just because you got to share some of that money with the other sports. But we still believe that there's going to be NIL spending up and above that, because if you're telling me that Georgia in the future, because of the revenue sharing, is only going to have a salary cap of about $13 or $14 million, that means one of two things. Either Georgia is spending far less money than some other programs allegedly are spending right now, or every player in college football is about to make far less money than they currently make, because we're led to believe that a team like Ohio State, for instance, perhaps others, budget a year ago, $25 million. Some numbers have been thrown around like $30 million. So, I mean, while there is about to be the revenue sharing money, the actual dollar spend for Georgia on its roster is still going to be supplemented with NIL to the point that the actual spending will be close to what it's been in the past, though, right?
Yeah, I would say it's got to be more legitimized, Brandon, and you got to find it on your own. It's got to be valid. Here's what I'm hearing is I've heard that literally, like, Brandon, some of these contracts were done where they wanted to get their money now, where some schools are telling their players that, like, hey, this might be the most money you get before this policy comes into effect, where there's now a hard cap, so to speak, or there's a hard allotment. That's where, like, you might have some players that come in as a freshman with the most money they're ever going to get. I think that's pretty interesting. But again, I don't see this extra NIL meaning like you're going to get an extra $1 or $2 million on top of what you're already making from the rev share. I think that's going to be very hard to do because, Brandon, I just go back to this. We live in a very big media market in Atlanta. I don't see Ozzie Albies. I don't see Chris Sale. I don't see Michael Penix. I don't see Grady Jarrett having millions of dollars worth of outside endorsements. The bulk of their salaries obviously come through their NFL contract.
That's true. Now, we've also pointed out before is that, like Oregon, for instance, is fighting, the state, is fighting to keep NIL agreements confidential. Therefore, they can't be scrutinized. And that, while the House settlement, the thing that sort of starts and all of the, work towards the revenue sharing payments, while that's been, kind of the main driver behind all of this, that's also not been completely agreed to yet either. And that a lot of this, I think, is still open to legal challenge, which people just sort of gloss, their eyes gloss over when you say this sort of thing. But, I think we're a long way from true agreement on any kind of cap on compensation. That any sort of cap on compensation, based on the recent track record of the court system, runs the risk of legal scrutiny. And I do think it's important to note that we probably got more of that coming when it comes to this sort of thing. If somebody really is going to tell a ready, willing, and able compensator that they can't compensate a player to the degree they want to, that does sort of sound like it could still be open to some legal scrutiny.
Well, Brandon, let's not be naive on it. I love how you went through the obstacle course there of compensation, but let's be honest, Brandon. One of the theories that abound right now is it could just go back to the way it was in 2017. Yeah. You can just, the good old fashioned NIL, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, might come back into play. But I think it's fascinating in this case, Brandon, because it's almost like a journalist doing math makes you want to swerve off the road. But like if this number's 14, you got to think, well, listen, Ohio State last year was an outlier where they paid a lot of fourth-year players, maybe second round, third round NFL pick money to come back and play one more year and chase that championship. I don't think. I think by and large, if you educate yourself on the way this could be done, it's if you have 14 million, then probably your current roster needs to probably take up at least 10 million, 11 million of that. Now, the bulk of the players you're going to have to compensate are going to be your freshmen, your redshirt freshmen, your redshirt sophomores, and your juniors. Georgia, like a lot of power programs, they have very few fifth-year seniors anymore or fourth-year seniors anymore, especially those that would be, need to be compensated well enough to keep them tamper-proof out of the portal. It's fascinating because this is a name we always come back to. I think the Jared Curtis recruitment is a very interesting test case because I do believe, Brandon, that his number will eventually come in around 1.5 to 2.5 million. And if you start doing the math, then if Georgia allocates $4 million to its incoming freshman, then you've got one guy taking up a very big chunk of that in terms of even the overall 14. And then you can get tricky with it if you have a Brock Bowers guy, or if you have a Gunnar Stockton type talent that's going to be a face of the program, then maybe that guy can get that extra NIL like what we've seen before with luxury apparel or the fast food chicken spots and everything else like that. That's how you can kind of up the number for your tried and true guys.
So since we last spoke, we now have an official commitment date for Jared Curtis. Curtis's camp trying to do everything it can to make it feel like, hey, this is a close battle, two teams that have a lot to offer. And if it truly is close, that means that just stands to reason that Georgia's compensation package is also in the same ballpark that what Oregon is offering too. Do you believe that's the case? Do you believe, this is, I think, been described other places as something close to like a 50-50 proposition. Do you think it's 50-50 right now for Georgia and Oregon when it comes to Jared Curtis? We won't have to wait very long to find out, but how close do you believe this is at the moment?
Well, Brandon, I guess I'll use a BA phrase here, and maybe Eddie will be grinning and smirking when I say this, but honesty compels me to admit, and maybe this is me speaking a little out of turn here, but I don't know how someone can look at Oregon and Georgia and say that they're equal in terms of national championships, in terms of, Oregon's developed some quarterbacks recently, but Auburn had a hand in Nix, and so did the former offensive coordinator, now that's the head coach at Arizona State. You see Dylan Gabriel is being projected to be a 6th, 7th round pick, and he'd been to Oklahoma, he'd been to Central Florida and Oregon. So if you sit there and you look at championships, you look at NFL pedigree, they shouldn't be even. They shouldn't be close to being even. Kirby Smart versus, Dan Lanning, amazing guy, amazing coach. But it's kind of like sort of comparing, in some ways, Kirby to Nick Saban when Kirby was just getting started at Georgia. I think the only way this thing becomes equal is, A, there's the facilities wonder and splendor at Oregon. There's the Nike appeal. There's the NIL compensation. And that's largely it, man. And you see everything else, championships, development. Oregon's great in all those areas, but Georgia is better in all those areas. You've got the fact that he would practice against 6, 7 future first rounders 3 or 4 times a day in practice. I don't know how even these schools can be unless you add in the NIL component there as well, because if you actually look at it, Oregon's got pretty stacked up with some really capable quarterbacks as well that look like they're going to have as long of a runway as well. Dante Moore, I don't know if you're familiar with that name. He was a former 5-star a couple years ago. Very promising quarterback, very incredible quarterback. And, his runway, this will be his first year to play too. So his runway is actually kind of long, like the way things are looking there with Gunnar Stockton as well at Georgia. So I don't know how they're equal, Brandon, especially when you include the location, the familiarity, and everything else like that. But I think these extemporary factors are kind of making them a lot more equal. And I still think, Brandon, that Georgia has kind of been the familiar, the family spot, the comfortability there. He knows what he's getting when he goes to Georgia and sees a Georgia practice. And he can also point very clearly, it may be 15, 20 years ago, Brandon, but it still counts. Mike Bobo has developed a 5-star quarterback into a number 1 overall pick in the draft. And that's something that no one at Oregon can say.
Obviously, last week we talked about Jordan Edmonds on the program, the 5-star cornerback, and you had an interesting story with him at DawgNation.com where he was set to commit a while ago. Jordan, perhaps others, convinced him to kind of hold off on that, but that convincing didn't last very long. Edmonds committed to Alabama this past week. What do you think happened there? I mean, a couple of things come to mind, I think, for a lot of Georgia fans. Thing number one is, this just sort of, as I said yesterday, puts a bigger spotlight on guys like Ellis Robinson, DeMello Jones, that from that group, you need at least one big-time cornerback to emerge. Perhaps a guy like Edmonds looks in on that, kind of guys waiting in the wings and says, boy, that's a pretty crowded cornerback situation. Not to say that Alabama doesn't have some cornerback depth too, but also primarily, I think, to a lot of Georgia fans, still kind of waiting to see Donte Williams put his stamp on the position as Georgia cornerback coach. Georgia fans make their position coaches very famous, very popular, and big recruiting battles are kind of the best way to earn that. Trey Scott, Todd Hartley, a lot of guys become much beloved by Georgia fans pretty quick. I would say that as of yet, Donte Williams, who I think that you reported, the Edmonds family and Williams had a good relationship with each other, but I think there is still a little bit of a wait and see of, hey, when is Donte Williams as the Georgia cornerbacks coach going to have that big moment where he becomes the kind of fan favorite with fans the way that other Georgia position coaches typically do? What do you make of what went down with Edmonds?
Well, Brian, Edmonds for the longest time was always kind of leaning Alabama. It's funny, they didn't even grow up in the state of Georgia. He grew up in Pittsburgh, that area, Pennsylvania. I'm going to tell you, Alabama got another one that should sting like Caleb Downs out of the state of Georgia. He's the real deal. He's legit. You get Jalen Walker-ish vibes about him. He's always smiling, always happy. Got a really interesting natural charisma. He's also really long. I'll echo kind of your point there, Brandon. I feel like Donte Williams, although he's very liked by the players on the team, he's very liked by the recruits I talked to. I think Donte Williams needs to have a big win this recruiting cycle. He needs to have one of those 565-foot home runs, one of those moonshot wins on the recruiting. I know you used to call them big booms. I still call them chortles. He needs to have one of those at the cornerback room, because it could be argued, and I do feel this way, that Georgia is set with 2 or 3 years of all SEC level cornerback play. I think DeMello Jones and Ellis Robinson are both going to be fantastic players for the Dawgs, probably 2-year starters for the Dawgs. And I think they're going to play really good football. You've also got Andre Evans, another guy that's been very heralded, that came in through that same recruiting class where Georgia just really had a lot of Titanic wins, and a lot of that you could put it on Fran Brown for getting them to the finish line there with Georgia. I really think that what Donte Williams does really well is he relates to young people, and also he's really his biggest wins on the recruiting trail so far. People probably don't know those yet. I think he had a hand and help in getting the Branch brothers acclimated and up to speed with Georgia, some familiarity there. But I also think he also had a hand in really a true hand. If you want to put down his greatest recruiting win for Georgia so far right now, I would probably say it would be the freshman cornerback, Dominic Kelly, as well, because Dominic was committed to USC and committed to Williams when he made his decision. He was an underclass in California who then reclassed up to the 2025 class. And Brandon, we've heard some very good things about Mr. Kelly. But right now, Georgia just hosted Dash a young man out of, they call him Dash, but Dash Arrington out of California, the 5-star. Usually he's the number 1 athlete or the number 1 cornerback in the country for most of the services. Brandon, he just visited Georgia. He took a multi-day visit. Of course, he quickly went back to USC in California, but he did say coming out of that visit that it is clear that Kirby Smart is the best coach in college football, and Georgia has intrigued him. So I would look for Georgia to get a visit, and I think that's where Donte Williams can play the hits right now on the recruiting trail, is he can get an inroad, and he has a really strong relationship with all the coaches in California to kind of keep that Cali talent coming back over to Georgia, especially the DBs.
I want to ask you a final question. There's no way you could have ever predicted this question, so I apologize for this coming completely out of nowhere. But it does sort of relate to some of the stuff we were talking about at the beginning of our conversation. Some of the big news for Georgia the last couple of days has involved a basketball player. Silas Demery is going to the transfer portal. And it certainly seems like Georgia's – I won't pretend to be an expert on this, but it seems like Georgia's probably not going to be able to keep him. And this kind of also coincides with what I guess has been discussed, Greg Sankey and others, but the fact that if you are a non-football basketball power, like a Villanova, St. John's, teams like that, that you're going to have the potential in the future to spend a lot more money on your roster than, like, say, the SEC basketball teams are on its roster, because when it comes to the house settlement, revenue-sharing world, obviously football, deservedly so, is going to get the lion's share of that money. Other sports get what's left over. And, for some programs in college basketball, they have no football. So therefore, basketball, men's basketball, is the kind of big money driver on that campus. I guess what I'm curious about, Jeff, is there a lot of Georgia fans that, love being great in football, but they have kind of enjoyed a little bit of relevance in basketball. They see what Auburn's doing. They see what the other SEC teams are doing. And given what's about to happen in revenue sharing, and given the fact that, hey, a player that Georgia fans have kind of grown to like, but seem like they're not going to be able to keep, money just may not be there, if I understand it correctly. What's about to happen to the SEC in basketball as it relates to all of this? And this unprecedented success the SEC is enjoying, is it going to be short-lived once every dollar you can find that's not nailed to the floor, you got to start trying to pump towards football to make sure that stays what it's been? What do you think's about to happen with basketball, though?
I think there's going to be a choke point, Brandon, of about a year, because one of the things you have to do when you write about these things and cover these things and try to understand these things is you try to get as much knowledge as you can. And what I think really is, when I mean a choke point, is that first year it's going to be 20.5 million, and the pie is, allotted maybe 70, maybe 75%. To football. But then gradually, Brandon, I'm very curious to see how quickly that 20.5 gets to 31, 32, because that's what I'm told is coming. It will gradually increase up to about 30 million. And then it's going to be a point where maybe football eventually takes up all 20.5 million. Now you just allocate the rest of it to other sports. I think that's interesting how you could kind of have big boys in basketball that have little or no semblance in NCAA Division I football. That could be very interesting. This is one of those things, Brendan, where I think the other sports are going to have to get very creative with the marketing. Because when you saw Josh Brooks, right? And he kept making those points like, hey, 90 seconds. We need the court. We need to have the court clear and the other team off the court for 90 seconds. And then you can rush the court. Because I think that NIL money matters. That fine they would have to pay matters. $250K might get you, the 13 games or so of a really good two guard or something like that. So I think that's what's going to happen. I think football in the SEC will always be king. I will also probably feel like what you saw with the SEC basketball and getting that many guys in the tournament is probably never going to happen again.
Could very well be the case. Jeff, great stuff. We appreciate your time. Where you are, is that a secret? Can we say where you are as we say goodbye to you? I never know what's a secret and what's not.
Yeah, no, man, this is a secret. It's pretty funny. We're going to check something off here, Brandon. I'm going to probably make you smile. This is the first time we've ever had a globe in the background, and this is not my Ron Burgundy Zoom background starter kit here. We're joining you from. I almost laugh if I have to say this. We're joining you from the special collections room of the Bowden Public Library.
How about that?
I was in Bowden this morning talking to Caden Prothro, the 5-star athlete.
One of our favorites, by the way. Love
interesting. You mind if I share little nuggets right now with you, man? Let people know.
By all means. I never know if you want to give it away on here, if you want maybe people to read it. But if you got some stuff on Caden Prothro, we are always all ears on that, because Prothro is clearly one of our favorites.
Yeah, Prothro. Interesting, Brent. I saw him work out this morning. He was pushing a sled. He's going to be very busy over the next few days, Brandon. He is in Texas this weekend for his first ever trip to Austin, Texas. Seems like Texas is trying to pull a 5-star rodeo with Caden Prothro and Mark Bowman. You saw crystal ball predictions there with Mark Bowman, the 5-star tight end as well.
I did.
But next week, Brandon, it is busy. He's going to see Auburn, Alabama, and Florida. And then he's also got a trip planned to North Carolina to go visit Bill Belichick as well. He says he's down to 5 schools. It's the same 5 schools. And kind of his touch and go on what he'd like to do as far as a timeline goes is he says he acknowledges there's a feel aspect to what he's going to do. If he feels right, he might go ahead and commit. But at the same time, he said he wants to take as long as possible to make his decision. while discussing all those visits to come, I'll give you a little nugget of what he saw at Georgia this past weekend, Brandon. He was back for a visit to Georgia. Georgia got the first unofficial visit out of the gate. He's really busy, Brandon. He's like you. He's got weightlifting. He's got basketball. Now he's playing baseball. He's the starting left fielder at Bowden High School at 6'6" at about 230. There was another strong visit for Georgia. It was the first time him and his family got the chance to kind of chill in Kirby's office. One thing that stood out of what he said is Kirby told the Prothro family that I don't want you to go on all these visits and feel like you need to be pigeonholed into being a tight end. He said your body may not grow and you may stay around 6'6", 230. In that way, you're probably best to be a receiver for us and be a receiver anywhere. But if you put on 20 pounds, maybe you start out as a wide receiver, but then you become a tight end. Caden says he wants to be a flex tight end where he plays a little bit attached from the line, but also gets his hand on the ground and gets dirty as well. So interesting little mini revelations, micro revelations there about what's going on with Caden Prothro. He said he's going to watch Elias Williams and he's going to watch Noah Thomas a lot this year. That could kind of be a roadmap or a blueprint for what his career might be with the Dogs.
Fascinating stuff, Jeff. We'll look forward to reading more of that at DawgNation.com. Safe travels coming back, and we'll certainly look forward to having you back here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger again very soon, too.
Yeah, don't heckle me, man, when I don't have a globe in the background at all times here, man. Well, take it easy, Brandon. See you, man.
Good stuff.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Yeah, you got to go to the guys to get the news. Jeff getting some of that when it comes to Caden Prothro. So very interesting stuff. And I'll say this real quick with the basketball thing, because it's like you watch Arkansas last night. You know, Arkansas had a big lead against Texas Tech. We'll talk more about this in a moment. Ultimately let that slip away. You know, people forget that Arkansas has some very rich boosters. You know, you think about other schools having a lot of money. Like, Arkansas's got crazy rich boosters. Jerry Jones, Walmart family, Tyson Chicken. There's like a big trucking magnate or something like that. They have like some crazy rich boosters. And what you see is I get, and I'm not an expert on this. I'm kind of out over my skis a little bit. But I guess like the Tyson, you know, they call him the Chicken Man. The Tyson Chicken guy is sort of a basketball booster. And a lot of other guys have said, well, we want to kind of focus our money in on football. You know, I guess in a roundabout way, you know, Georgia probably just needs its basketball booster. That a lot of the sort of the super rich folks here that would be, you know, intent on giving money to Georgia, a lot of that goes towards football because Georgia football is so popular. People are going to like what they like, you know, and people like football. 90-something% of our audience sort of only wants to hear football. That's just the nature of it. But there are people who also do like Georgia basketball. And, you know, you kind of wonder, can you cultivate the sort of rich guy booster who wants to support the basketball team? That might be what the future sort of holds. Obviously, Georgia itself, from an institutional standpoint, shown a pretty big commitment to basketball. Can they find that sort of benefactor type guy to sort of, you know, help that effort along? Perhaps that's the next step on all of this. Now, let's get ready to go cruise around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. Obviously, we're looking forward to our Dog Nation cruise coming up in a couple of weeks, but I'm also always so excited to tell you about all the things that are happening with Royal Caribbean. And I think one of the important things to know, you know, I tell you all the time about Jessica Slater, you know, having a conversation sort of several months in advance of whenever you might want to take a cruise vacation, I think it's a really smart thing to do. First of all, I would say that your savings are always going to be better the sooner that you book. So if you're sort of already thinking about, you know, certainly summer, waiting, by no means too early to start thinking about that, but also, you know, late 2025, even into 2026, you know, there is time to be thinking about the great things happening with Royal Caribbean. And obviously, we've been excited over the course of the last year to celebrate the newest ship in the fleet, Utopia of the Seas. But keep in mind, Star of the Seas is going to be debuting here in August. The brand new Icon class of ship, going to be an amazing vessel introduced here. It'll be sailing out of Port Canaveral. So if you want to start thinking about kind of late summer into the fall, towards the end of the year, or early 2026, thinking about a trip on Star of the Seas is a great cruise vacation that you got to consider with our friends at Royal Caribbean. Also, the debut of the Royal Beach Club at Paradise Islands in the Bahamas. You know, a lot of folks have sailed before. They've been to Nassau. Maybe they sort of feel like they've been there, done that as it relates to Nassau. That's about to change because the biggest introduction of really anything from kind of a destination standpoint is going to be this Royal Beach Club there at Paradise Island. Right there, convenient to the port. You get off the Royal Caribbean cruise ship, an exclusive for those on a Royal Caribbean Cruise vacation. You go to this gorgeous Royal Beach Club. What an experience that's going to be. Now, I can tell you about it, but Jessica Slater, a terrific travel agent, a wonderful travel advisor, can tell you even more. You can give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can also email her, jslater@dreamvacations.com. She'll get you ready to go on a Royal Caribbean Cruise vacation as we cruise through the year of 2025. And speaking of cruising, let's cruise around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. Let me start with this kind of outside the SEC, but I think you'll find this to be funny. So the most outspoken coach in college football the last month or so, last couple of months, seems like it's been Nebraska coach Matt Rhule. Pretty annoying, if I'm being honest here. A guy that I sort of grates on me just a bit. You may find this entertaining, though. So Rhule, I guess the other day, was talking about Dylan Raiola. And the one thing that he said in a press conference is, and obviously Raiola, the former Georgia commit, the one thing that that Rhule said in the press conference is, listen, Dylan Raiola can't be 240 pounds. And a lot of people in the media then, as would seem to be common sense, reported that Raiola must be having issues with his weight because Matt Rhule said as much during a press conference. Well, apparently that must have caused a problem between Raiola and Rhule. And so Rhule comes back out to try to correct the record of, people thought I said that Raiola can't be 240 pounds. I didn't mean he was 240 pounds. I just mean that he can't be 240 pounds. It has been pointed out by others that since Raiola has been on the Nebraska roster, that his weight has been listed at 230 pounds. So from a roster listing standpoint, it hasn't changed. But clearly something was going on with the weight standpoint from Raiola. That's why Rhule said what he said. And try to backtrack on that seems a little, I don't know. I want to say weaselly. Maybe that's an unfair word to use. But like trying to blame the media for something you said seems to be somewhat weaselly behavior from Matt Rhule. Perhaps not the first example of that. But if you're a Georgia fan and been kind of wondering what's been going on with Dylan Raiola since his AI-assisted poem let you know that he was going to Nebraska, Matt Rhule in hot water for what he may or may not have said about Raiola's weight, that is an example of that. Now, in the SEC, former SEC figure, also a somewhat notorious figure from a Georgia standpoint, is the former Tennessee coach Jeremy Pruitt. Pruitt is suing the NCAA for $100 million in lost wages. Now, I'm going to tell you this right now. I don't really like Jeremy Pruitt. I think that Jeremy Pruitt behaved, at least based on the reporting that I have read and the people that I've talked to, behaved pretty despicably towards Mark Richt. I don't like anybody who mistreats Mark Richt. Just a hard and fast rule for me. You mistreat Mark Richt, you're not on my good side. Jeremy Pruitt is not on my good side. Probably a pretty good coach. I think he knows a lot about football, but, you know, a little rough around the edges perhaps. However, on this suit against the NCAA for $100 million in lost wages, the best that I can tell, I'm not a lawyer, but I have watched lots of courtroom dramas on TV and movies. The best that I can tell is I believe that Pruitt is likely on the side of the Angels on this one. I really do. It just seems obvious to me from a few hundred miles away, a couple hundred miles away, that Tennessee set him up to be a scapegoat about, you know, the NCAA issues, and they felt like they rushed into hiring him and they wanted an excuse to fire him with cause without having to pay the buyout, so they'd have money to buy a new coach, but also avoid some embarrassment. And so they sort of set him up to be this guy that was, you know, acting improperly as it relates to the NCAA. And so therefore, hey, we're going to wash our hands of this. You know, we welcome NCAA scrutiny. We're going to point all the finger of blame towards Pruitt. We're going to get rid of him. We're going to move on. Now, Josh Heupel has done well on the field compared to previous iterations of Tennessee football. So from that standpoint, it's sort of working out okay. But all of this, the best that I can tell, and as I said before, I come to this from the place of a person that doesn't really like Jeremy Pruitt, doesn't think of Pruitt as probably a great guy. But the best that I can tell is that Pruitt, based on my understanding, is absolutely right to sue the NCAA over this, was absolutely set up as the fall guy here. He was, a lot of JFK stuff in the news lately, he was the patsy on all of this, the sort of the easy person to blame when it comes to this type of deal. And it just sort of seems obvious to me. And what's funny is that, and this is what it kind of always comes down to, is that Pruitt says, listen, there was NCAA cheating going on prior to when I got here, and I told my then boss, Philip Fulmer, about it. And see, this is where these lawsuits kind of always become a little tricky for the larger entity involved, in this case, the football program, is that, and you see all kinds of situations where, like, just the big entity doesn't want to go to court because you have this thing called discovery, and all of a sudden people start saying what they know, and you start reading emails, and you start, requesting records. And, typically speaking, the big entity in all kinds of walks of life doesn't really want that to have happen. And so Pruitt apparently is coming armed with, well, listen, I told him about this, that, and the other, and Fulmer said he would, quote unquote, take care of it. So if I'm Jeremy Pruitt, I'm fighting as dirty as I can on this because, he was young enough that he could have worked for a lot longer. And I don't think $100 million is necessarily a small amount of money, given the fact that he was essentially rendered unable to work because of what, at least in my eyes, and I'm not a lawyer, looked to be a little bit of a setup. So I am anti-Pruitt in general, but sort of pro-Pruitt when it comes to this lawsuit. He certainly seems like the sort of easy, soft target for Tennessee on this. So I guess I wish him well as far as all that's concerned. We'll give you an update once one becomes available. Sweet 16 last night. We told you to expect a lot of points in Alabama and BYU. We got that right. Alabama coast to an easy win there, putting up 113 points. Florida also pretty dominant for the most part over Maryland. So do you remember when there were a lot of people, and I honestly don't even care that much about this. I'm just pointing out. Do you remember when after the Texas loss in the play-in game and the first round when like Georgia, Missouri, a few teams like that lost, boy, there were a lot of people who were pointing out, the SEC, so much for being the best conference of all time. Well, since then, we have seen a lot of success from the SEC. And all I want you to notice is that the people who were there to notice the SEC losses perhaps are not quite as vocal about the SEC wins. As I said before, I don't really care, but I do think you should notice that when it comes to whatever the prevailing conversation is, completely fair and balanced, just calling balls and strikes, I don't know how much that happens. There's definitely, if you feel like something's going on, sometimes it sort of seems like there might be as it relates to stuff like that. A lot quieter on the how are the various conferences doing in the NCAA tournament since the SEC started winning. Now, Arkansas did not have the same good fortune. They were also the worst seeded team, the only double-digit seed in the Sweet 16. They had a big lead last night against Texas Tech. Let it slip away. I'm not going to lie to you. I was sound asleep on the couch well before this game or the Duke-Arizona game ended. It sounds like it was a horrific collapse, though, by Arkansas. And it sounds like John Calipari, who was actually working on kind of a nice story of doing better in the tournament than he had been doing at Kentucky. I think Wildcats fans, Big Blue Nation, probably enjoying the Calipari collapse last night. Speaking of Alabama, they scored 100 points, as we told you, 113. Their opponent, Duke, also, they'll play Duke on Saturday. Duke also put up 100 last night, knocking off Arizona. It was a pretty good game. Once again, I fell asleep before this one ended, but it was certainly very entertaining. There's nothing, by the way, more frustrating than that. We've been waiting the entire tournament for good games, and we finally get some on a Thursday night for games that won't end until after midnight. That's pretty frustrating, all things considered. So that leads you to games today. Tennessee, Kentucky, I think, is a lot of fun. We do like the Vols in that spot. Ole Miss, Michigan State, I think, is a lot of fun, too. Keep in mind, the number we gave you, and this is a little bit convoluted, but it's already worked out in the tournament. We do not have a lot of instances of teams that were a 1 or a 2 seed but began the year as unranked, exceeding that seed in the NCAA tournaments. It's like early 1980s when you kind of went to the 64-team format. Unranked preseason teams that become top 2 seeds don't typically advance past their seed. That means a 2 seed making the Final Four, a 1 seed winning the national championship, as a for instance. St. John's was an example of that. St. John's was the darling of much of this before the tournament began. An early exit, mostly surprising from them. So tonight, Michigan State sort of looks like the favorite against Ole Miss. I think Ole Miss may be, if you're looking for an underdog, I think Ole Miss may be a live dog against Michigan State here tonight. Some people think that's Michigan against Auburn, but keep in mind, everybody and your brother has seen Auburn struggle as of late. They lost 3 of 4 to conclude the regular season, didn't advance in the SEC tournament, kind of sleptwalked through their first 2 NCAA tournament games, yet they're a 9-point favorite against Michigan. So in other words, everybody has seen the same stuff you've seen from Auburn and somehow still installed as a 9-point favorite over a Michigan team that some folks kind of like right now. That tells you everything you need to know. We think Auburn probably coasts here tonight. Houston probably as well. So that's 4 games. We'll give you an update on our Golden Shoe Bracket Challenge in a moment, then come back and do that once the Final Four is set when we're here on Monday. For now, though, we'll make that cruise around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. Now, earlier in the show, we talked about the Georgia linebackers perhaps being a strength and how much fun that could be for the Georgia defense this season. Let's keep that conversation going right now as we transition into our Long Finish presented by the Finnish Long Drink. And one of the things we sort of fixated on a moment ago is, hey, it seems like sometimes national media may not be fully aware of just how deep that position group even is. In particular, when it comes to a guy like Justin Williams, who in many ways, and we touched on these a moment ago, brings a lot to the table for Georgia when it comes to his ability, his play on the field, but also, human connection off the field, proper motivation off the field, the sort of touchier-feelier parts of the football team. That's also something that Justin Williams is a key contributor on as well. And if you want to go back to earlier this week, Kirby Smart talked about that in particular, the fact that Williams brings a real positive vibe to this Georgia program that everybody seems to feed off of. This was Kirby Smart earlier this week.
Well, he's probably one of the most positive people I've ever been around. He inspires hustle, effort. I just love the kid's energy. He's never down in the dogs. He competes. I think that he is the kind of alpha you need at the inside linebacker position. He's gotten better. He's trying to add some weight. He's still in that, 215, 220 range. I think he wants to be 225, so he's been fighting that. But, man, he competes. And if we're basing our team and our roster and our culture on, fire, passion, and energy, he embodies that. So we want to embrace that with him.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that description. And if you want to hear more about why Smart would call someone like Justin Williams one of the most positive people he's ever been around, I want you to hear a little bit more from Justin Williams. We played a fun clip yesterday of Williams describing what he'd seen from Nate Frazier in practice. I thought that was great. How about the other guy that he often lines up with at linebacker, a guy that is going to be mentioned alongside Williams because they came at the same time, that being Chris Cole. If you want to get really excited about what Chris Cole might be, and if you want to like more about why Kirby Smart enjoys being around Justin Williams so much, listening to the comparison that Justin Williams made for Chris Cole, I think is just really fun here. So as a part of our Long Finish presented by the Finnish Long Drink, here is that very, very positive personality that Smart thinks he sees when he sees Justin Williams, and Williams uses that to describe Chris Cole.
What impresses me the most is he's I don't want to do comparisons, but he's like J-Wall. He's versatile. He can do pass rush. He can cover. He can key the line. He can play run. He can do whatever you need him to do, and he's going to be there. And he makes me a better player every day. Seeing him go chase the quarterback, it makes me like, I got to pick it up because that's my best friend. We play with each other every day, and he just makes me a better player, and I want to be like him and just work as hard as him.
The J-Walk is Jalen Walker. Jalen Walker was the Butkus Award winner and a possible top 10 pick in the upcoming NFL draft. So that is what Justin Williams says he sees when he looks at Chris Cole. Another reason why the Georgia linebacker room this season could be a ton of fun, and to kind of piggyback on what Kirby Smart was saying, when it comes to the relentless positivity of a guy like Justin Williams, it's really worth your time to go to our DawgNation YouTube page, watch all of that in its entirety from Justin. Just really good stuff throughout the entirety of the time. We're going to play more Justin Williams stuff for you in the days to come, but just a really, really fun conversation with what seems to be a pretty cool guy at the Georgia linebacker position. And that is the Long Finish presented by the Finnish Long Drink. Now, you're going into a weekend where I think the weather's supposed to actually maybe it rain tomorrow, but either way, whatever you're doing here this weekend, the Finnish Long Drink goes great with it. You're hanging out in the back patio with friends, you're playing golf, you're going to watch your kids play sports, maybe a cooler full of the Finnish Long Drink. Who are we to judge about that? Whatever you got going on, the Finnish Long Drink goes great with it. It is a ready-to-drink cocktail, a mixed drink that you don't have to mix yourself. You can pour it into a glass over ice. That looks great. You can drink it straight out of the can. That's a lot of fun, too, especially these ice-cold cans where the condensation just drips down the side. You love all of that. So if you are ready to pick some more up and you're like, BA, where do I get it? Well, listen, the easiest thing to do is go to thelongdrink.com. That's the website, thelongdrink.com. Put in your zip code. You can find out where you can get some today. All the varieties. There is one for you. Cranberry, long drink strong, long drink, the peach-flavored version. There is a long drink variety that I know you're going to love. So make sure you try some today. So by way of a golden shoe to wrap us up here today, we can bring that music down just a little bit. By way of a golden shoe to wrap us up here today, let's give you an update on our golden shoe bracket standings. I'm going to give you the top 10 here for a moment because I think it's sort of anybody's ball game. I believe I'm also in 89th place, so it's my own contest. I'm barely cracking the top 90 right now, so certainly mock me at your leisure. Jesse Simmons coming in at number 1. Jeremy Smith, second place. Alex Nader also tied for second. Craig Gear, Robbie Rainey, Robert Saltaformaggio, William Blake, Sean Leathery, and Brent Walensky all tied for 4th right now. David Dawg coming in at number 10. So potential national champions, all these teams still alive. You got some Duke. You got a couple of Auburns. You got a Houston. So if you're looking at, you got one Florida. So Gear is the only guy with Florida. So Florida obviously plays on. If you're thinking about actually winning this contest, we respect the sanctity of brackets. The fact that Gear, of the top folks, sort of has the unique national champion, perhaps that's an advantage for him, and potentially we'll see if that plays out that way. We'll update these again coming up on Monday. Speaking of Florida, if you need to pick them to win your bracket, hey, that's your business. But when it comes to football, we'll be here to remind you, the lousy, stinking Gators, it's been 1,602 days since they've beaten Georgia. That is our Gator Hater Updater. Y'all have a great weekend. We'll see you back here Monday, DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. I meant to mention this during the show, but let's also give best wishes out to the Diamond Dogs. Big series this weekend. Auburn coming to call. That is going to be a really big deal. We can't wait for that. I'm also looking forward tonight to be with the Athens Rock Lobsters, our friends from Serve Pro. That's going to be a lot of fun here, too. So big weekend ongoing. We can't wait for all of that. All right, let's get some comments. We'll get ready to go here. Baruch Dog says he's not going to be able to win. He says, I already lost Iowa State, and Jesse has the same champion as I do. Yeah, sometimes it kind of comes down to that where, you need to be unique enough where you win the games, but you also have some separation from some of the teams, some of the participants that sort of pick some of the same teams. That's right. That's indeed true. So we're going to see some changing. Last year we saw our friend Shanna was leading the entire time, and then it kind of slipped away there at the end. And because keep in mind, based on a typical bracket scoring system, and you can go to the CBS website and see how we're doing this. Based on a typical bracket scoring system, you get a lot more points for picks later on. So the leaderboard will change pretty dramatically as those with teams still alive have those picks become correct. You typically get like 1 point for a first-round game, but you get huge point totals as you move through other games. Let's see what else. Let's see what else is going on here. Let me check out YouTube. Greg Hendricks asking, will we be at G-Day? You better believe we'll be at G-Day. We're looking forward to that. We're taking a little bit of time off for spring break prior to G-Day, but we will be back for G-Day for sure. Jonathan Aaron asking me about the JFK conspiracy theories. Let me tell you something. There is nothing I love more than to sit here and talk about all my JFK conspiracy theories. Something tells me I better not do that. Kaylee Manziel wants me to do it. Something tells me I better not do that. But I could do at least 2 hours on my various theories on that. I'll say this, is that some of the most common ones I at least think are a possibility. There is one fairly common suggestion that I don't think is possible at all. I also think a theory that almost never gets mentioned is somewhat possible. Actually, maybe even more than somewhat possible. I am quite open to this being something other than just Lee Harvey Oswald. I am quite. He wants me to do this. I am quite open to the possibility it's more than just Lee Harvey Oswald, but I don't know that we're going to go there today. Yeah. So there you go. Kaylee knows some of my theories on this. We've talked about this before. Let's see what else. Richie Bell says that Georgia couldn't get the time right with ESPN. That's why it's not being televised. That's certainly what they said, but kind of along the lines of Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. Just because they said it doesn't mean that's how it went down. And with all due respect to our friends at Georgia who we love, I don't quite know that. I don't quite know that it was a scheduling conflict that prevented the game from being televised. But that is obviously what they said. Let's see what else. Taylor Russell said the three-letter organizations are listening in. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know about that. Like one of these days we may start like another channel where we just talk about whatever, but that day is not today. That day is not today. Foster Moss says BA was Oswald. So like there was a time in my life where I absolutely would have said yeah, because like I'm old enough to remember when like the JFK movie came out, and there were that and like when that was popular, there were a lot of other like TV specials and things like that sort of act to refute all of those things. And for the most part, I just sort of bought all that. It's like, hey, if serious people are saying this, they must be right because that's how they got to be serious people. Not quite as much anymore, but like I said, that's a different topic for a different day. Alan Hampton says he can tell exactly where he was when he heard the news about JFK. Yeah, so like I obviously wasn't alive when that happened, but I do know that's one of those. And there's a handful of these, and we won't have to get too serious in all those because some of these are pretty serious. They're kind of a handful of moments in history where if you were alive for that moment, you absolutely remember. And you remember all of it in vivid detail. And for my family members who were, that's one of the things they always said. Hey, I remember exactly where I was, exactly when you heard that. Yeah, that's one of those things you definitely heard a lot of for sure. Let me get some Facebook comments. And y'all stop arguing in the YouTube. You don't have to argue so much. I mean, actually, you can do whatever you want. I don't care. But I mean, y'all do argue a lot. Let's see what else. On Facebook. Marshall Fleming also wants more JFK talk. Yeah, one of these days. One of these days. We may have to get one of those like. Yeah. Well, we may have to get one day like one of those things where like you have to sign up to enter it or something like that. Not for a fee, but like. By choosing to enter, you choose to hear something other than Georgia football talk. Bill Sanders, very funny. Philip Jordan Wells, very funny. Kent Holcomb also looking for a big weekend for the Diamond Dogs against Auburn. Yeah, I think this is a fun series. And if you get a chance to go, you really should. And it's not a commercial, not an ad, but we love to go. We can't. Unfortunately, we don't always get to go in our family as much as we like to because we have, a lot going on, sports, things like that. But tell you, it really is a fun experience. College baseball is red hot right now, red hot, and it's never going to get the support it deserves. It just never. I'm not talking about from Georgia. I'm talking about college athletics in general is just never going to give baseball what it deserves. There is such a higher ceiling for popularity that sport could achieve. but it's just not going to be resourced in the right way. It's just never going to be. But it's one of the few things in life that is true, totally organic. Just people have decided they like college baseball. And with almost no promotion, with almost no fanfare, with almost nothing, to use bad grammar, college baseball has just become a little bit of a thing, especially in places that far removed from Major League Baseball. If you're 400 miles from the closest Major League ballpark, college baseball is probably a pretty big deal where you live. It's just amazing how organic the growth has been, and you're always left to wonder, gosh, how much bigger could this be? We will never find that out because it'll never get the resources it deserves. But it's a really, really great sport. Robert Brown mentioned in cable news. Now, listen, there's no partisan anything ever. That's one thing we're very serious about. We're very, very serious about, because the cool thing about what I do is that I meet all kinds of people, and I love this about Georgia football. That Georgia football just brings in all kinds of people from all kinds of walks of life, from, just all kinds of backgrounds, all kinds of whatever. And I do my best to try to show respect to all the people that, like Georgia football. And so, anything that kind of removes friction from a fun Georgia football conversation, we work really hard to do that. It's sort of like, and by the way, when we joke about like JFK or something like that, that's got nothing to do with like partisan politics. That's, they're people on all sides of the whatever that think, whatever about that. But we are very, very serious about trying to avoid anything like that. Chastain Coleman, I know there's criticism of Snitker after the bullpen thing from yesterday. I mean, in like the sort of late middle innings, you got to try to find a way to get through them. And you're going to have some of that blow up. I mean, you are going to have some of that blow up on you. Was that a high leverage spot or not? I don't know. I don't know. But sometimes you're going to have, ask guys just sort of come through in a spot like that. Yesterday it didn't quite work out. Kind of a wild game. Sale didn't give you a good first inning. Albies comes back and change the game for you. And then you have kind of the blow up late. I do love though, because like I was at a baseball game yesterday, not the Braves, and so I'm trying to follow all this, and I do love to have mad Braves fans back in my life again. Like complaining about the bullpen. This is what baseball is. It's sort of the day to day. Oh my gosh, can you believe whatever? And I'm just sort of glad to have that back in my life again. RKD predicting the Bama game as a loss. Listen, I'd rather y'all fight with each other than predict losses. Let's see what else. Taylor Russell talking about things you remember. Remember where you were when Keely Ringo got the interception. Yeah, I remember that, man. That was a very emotional thing. A very emotional thing. And like one thing I always kind of remember about that is that, prior to that, I mean, actually even after that, like Georgia to me was only up with, it's 33-18, so Georgia's up 15. That's still like with 50 seconds to go, that's still kind of a 2-possession game. You got Bryce Young as the other quarterback. It's like even after that, because like Chris Fowler had the great play-by-play call, basically calling Georgia the winner. And what I've said is, as someone who does a little bit of play-by-play, certainly not at the same level that Chris Fowler does, not even close, that I don't know that I would have been able to call that way, because in my mind, hey, 50 seconds, Heisman quarterback for Alabama. Do you march down the field? Do you turn it into kind of a one-possession game? And, until, that final, sack, until you got Young down on the field for the final time on the turf, it's one of those things that even after the Ringo interception, I still needed to see zeros in that clock to believe that Georgia had actually won the game. That's one of my memories from that. Also, calling my wife and kids at home, and they're jumping around, they're acting crazy. It's like one of those things you just sort of wanted to find somebody to celebrate with, and that was a great experience. Foster Moss says, I need a side podcast. One of these days. It's like that's like sort of the thing in media now. It's like you got your main job. You got sort of like a little side podcast. I don't know that I'm going to be allowed to have any side podcasts, but don't think I don't notice that. Derek Lewis, thanks for the kind words. I appreciate that. Yeah, Foster Moss and the subject of, emotional, maybe the radio booth. Yeah, I mean, it was. It's one of those things where I think for a lot of us, a lot of memories came flooding back, and it involves people we enjoyed games with. It involves our own experience of the games. And frankly, while you never want hard luck losses, there is some sort of scar tissue that comes from that makes what happens in a situation like this more poignant. It just definitely does. Definitely does. Yeah, really good stuff. Johnny Surf Dog says Keeley picking that ball off and running it back was the most exhilarating moment in Georgia football history. Such a relief of pressure for 41 years of not getting over the hump. I think it's probably true. It's one of those things where, rewatching the video clips of that, and you see them frequently, it still feels almost just as engaging, just as electrifying as it did at the moment it happened. It really does. I'm very, very. I mean, think about this. This is kind of a corny thing, but I think about this a lot. Like we could have been alive during any era, right? We could have been alive 100 years from now or 100 years ago. The fact that we're here now experiencing this, in the prime of our lives, that's great, right? I mean, you can't ask for more than that. Janelle says over in Facebook, they don't fight each other, they just fight the bots, which is probably the case. Janelle, we appreciate you fighting that good fight every day. Our good friend Faraday Pippin, who's going to be with us tonight, by the way, with Serpro, mentioned the sort of alternate videos you may have seen with like the Titanic music added and stuff like that. Yeah, that's all good stuff. Ken Holcomb also critical of Dylan Lee staying in the game yesterday. Yeah, I mean, there's going to be a lot of that. We said before that, like, completely different topic, but like, pitching changes when you make them, when you don't, a little bit like play calling. That if in the history of sports talk, football play calling, number one most criticized thing, kind of right underneath that, pitching changes, either the ones that do get made, the ones that don't get made, probably a pretty big example of that. DMart42 says an underrated famous Larry Munson call. I'm thinking it, you're thinking it too. Now we got to kick off. Yeah, that sounds like a great scene setter from Larry Munson for sure. Bill Camacho checking out. UGA Marine says he would listen to the side podcast. Maybe we could take down Joe Rogan. Yeah, listen, I don't know about that, but a man can dream, I guess. Randy Hall says we may have our greatest linebacker room ever. Yeah, I mean, I think it's entirely possible. Now, inside linebacker for sure. Outside linebacker, we still don't quite know, but inside for sure. UGA Marine says a nightly D&D show with some of the folks in here. We talk about everything that BA won't talk about. Yeah. Yeah, there is a long list of things we don't talk about. And a little bit like, here's what I sort of think about the show as. And this may not be rightly or wrongly, this is sort of what I think about the show as. Because it's a pretty, I mean, many of you are like listening in earbuds, right? That's a pretty intimate relationship. So I think of myself a little bit like a guest at your dinner table. And honestly, like the podcast version of me is probably a slightly, I mean, if you ever see me in person, I don't talk nearly as loudly in real life as I do in the podcast. I'm like a lot of people. You would see me on the air, you think I'm very extroverted, kind of animated, whatever else. But if you see me in private or in person, I'm not really that way very much. I mean, I can turn it on when I sort of have to, but I'm pretty introverted in my private life. The point is that for a show like this, I sort of think about if I'm a guest in your home, if you've invited me to dinner, if I'm, sitting in your living room, I'm not necessarily telling you everything I think about every single issue. Could be kind of obnoxious. I'm sort of there for the reason you invited me. And in this particular case, if I'm in your home right now, if I'm in your car with you, wherever I am, you've sort of invited me to talk about Georgia football. So things that are not Georgia football, I do try to be pretty careful with. Or things that somewhat relate to Georgia football, but my opinion goes a little deeper on that subject than just basic college football talk, I try to throttle back on just a little bit out of respect for the people who choose to listen. You could maybe score some more points by being a little bit more aggressive with some things, but for now, we've got all the listeners we need. Maybe one day we'll do it differently, but that's the way we do it for now. All right, let us see what else. All right, we're going to get ready to go. RKD says 6 more long months till the season. Yeah, listen, I'm like anybody else. I count down to the season, but I love spring and summer, man. I love it. I love it. I love the season, and but I don't want to count down past that too quick, because honestly, some of the best stuff that happens in the spring and summer. Alan Hampton, thanks for the kind words. Appreciate that. All right, we're going to go for now. Y'all check out R.S. Andrews online, rsandrews.com, for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price is promised. You can trust them on that. Mention warm weather. That means getting your air conditioning tuned up. That's what R.S. Andrews is all about. So find them online, rsandrews.com. Have a great weekend, everybody. Check them out if you have a water heater break, emergency situation. The RS stands for rapid service. That means they are coming to you quickly to meet your need, whatever it might be. So online at rsandrews.com. Have a great weekend. Go Diamond Dogs. Beat Auburn. We'll see you tonight with the Rock Lobsters and our friends at Serve Pro. Back here Monday. DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger. We'll look forward to talking to you then.